electronics and artificial intelligence to exploit our vulnerabilities. I think I'm maybe the only one old enough to remember, but ever since World War II, we've been in a position to say that we really had essentially the best of everything, and that ceased to be true. And we know what happened during the Obama administration, because I know you were active there, but we actually dropped our military funding by 25% during the last 5 years of that administration, which would have been from 2010 to 2015. So that modernization was on hold. For decades, we starved investments in our nuclear weapons and infrastructure. In stark contrast, China and Russia expanded their stockpiles, building thousands of additional missiles to threaten the United States and our allies. In fact, during that time, the 5-year period that I referred to, China actually increased their activity by some 83%, while we had dropped ours 25%. The 2018 NDS and several years of stable funding, we were on the course correction we needed. Our military has started to recover, but still a long ways to go. President Biden must replace the $550 billion of defense funding cut by sequestration, and Congress will need to work with him to do so. This investment is down payment required to maintain our position against China and Russia over the next several decades. It will give our military leaders the predictability and certainty that they've asked for time and time again in this very room. Working with the soon-to-be chairman, I will continue to fight for this. And look, Dr. Hicks, our nation needs strong civilian leadership at the Pentagon. You and Secretary Austin must tackle these problems head on, and if we hope to preserve and defend our way of life, we can't afford to backslide. This will be my last meeting to actually chair, and the chairmanship will go to Senator Reid after this. Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I join you in welcoming Dr. Hicks to this morning's hearing. And I want to thank her for her willingness to serve again. She served her entire life, it seems, in the defense of the nation. Thank you again for that. Let me welcome your husband, Tom. I know your children are watching this avidly from afar and very proud of their mother. Finally, I want to recognize and thank former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates for his introduction, but more than that, for his extraordinary work as Secretary of Defense under 2 presidents. He's certainly an example of the very best in public service. And let me also recognize and thank my colleague, Senator Shaheen, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, Senator Shaheen. Dr. Hicks is a highly regarded national security and defense policy expert with extensive experience in government and the private sector. She has served in senior-level positions in the Department of Defense, as well as with public policy research organizations, including her recent tenure as a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. This committee has also relied on Dr. Hicks's expertise to shape defense policy and conduct oversight. Her testimony before the committee helped inform the Goldwater-Nichols reforms included in the FY 2017 National Defense Act, and she has also testified on civil-military relations. Most recently, Dr. Hicks served as a member of the National Defense Strategy Commission, which provided valuable analysis for this committee's consideration as we conducted oversight on NDS implementation. If confirmed, Dr. Hicks would be the first woman confirmed by the Senate to serve as the Deputy Secretary of Defense. She is exceptionally qualified for this position, and her background and expertise should serve her well. The Deputy Secretary of Defense position is complementary to the Secretary of Defense and equally critical. The Deputy is focused on the internal management of the department, and it takes considerable skill to administer a large and diverse bureaucracy like the Department of Defense. If done effectively, it can enable the Secretary to focus primarily on establishing defense policy and maintaining alliances and partnerships while developing strategy to counter our competitors. And one of the most consequential decisions for the Deputy Secretary of Defense is how to allocate budget resources for the development of weapons platforms and cutting-edge technologies. This year will be an inflection point in how the department prioritizes the resources it needs to accomplish its missions, given that the fiscal year 2022 budget will not be constrained by the Budget Control Act. Dr. Hicks, as we discussed during our office call, one of the primary challenges you will face is how to transform how the department operates. Transformation includes ensuring the department is postured to face future threats, which means harnessing cutting-edge technologies like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, and cybersecurity, while also divesting of legacy systems that are not optimized for future combat. But transformation also includes becoming more efficient in managing the back office of literally one of the largest bureaucracies in the world. Transformation of the Defense Department is not new and has been tried before, but it inevitably faces obstacles. One complication can be service parochialism, as each military service is responsible for the platforms that are needed to meet mission requirements, and each service has their favorites. Such parochialism can also extend to the civilian components of the OSD staff, making efficiency initiatives difficult. Also, the interest of individual members of Congress can also hinder change, particularly in the retirement of legacy systems. Dr. Hicks, I hope you will share with this committee your thoughts on how you intend to manage this process if you are confirmed. The other issue you'll need to immediately address is filling the civilian vacancies in the department and revitalizing civil-military relations. There are always multiple positions that need to be filled at the start of any new administration. However, I am concerned about the morale in the department, given that the previous administration made a concerted effort to leave multiple senior-level civilian officers unfilled, necessitating the installment of career or mid-level officials into senior positions in an acting capacity. Furthermore, large numbers of experienced career civilians left the department during the past 4 years, leaving a dearth of expertise and increasing the workload on those who remained. Secretary Austin has pledged his commitment to repairing civil-military relations and empowering civilians at all echelons of the department, and if you are confirmed, you will be integral to this effort. Finally, every member of this committee wants to ensure that high-caliber candidates serve in the department, and we will continue to fully evaluate and expeditiously consider nominees for these positions. Filling these vacancies quickly and with capable and talented individuals will ensure the department is operating effectively. I want to thank Chairman Inhofe for working to schedule a prompt confirmation hearing for Dr. Hicks. And Dr. Hicks, if you are confirmed, I hope you will work closely with Secretary Austin to fill these positions and provide steady leadership for the department. Dr. Hicks, we face many challenges that will require strong leadership and the ability to make tough decisions. Thank you again for your willingness to serve our country. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Senator Reid. With some senators attending remotely, I want to let everyone know how we're going to run things. Since it's not possible to know exactly when our colleagues who will be joining us via computer, when they arrive, we will not be following our standard early bird timing rule. Instead, we'll handle the order of questions by seniority, alternating side to side until we've gone through everyone. We will do the standard 5-minute rounds, and I ask my colleagues on the computers to please keep an eye on the clock, which you should have on your screen. And finally, to allow for everyone to be heard, whether in the room or on the computer, I ask all colleagues to please mute your microphones when you're not speaking. Dr. Hicks will begin with your opening statement. You are recognized.
Well, good morning, Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Reid, and committee members. I am honored to come before you today as President Biden's nominee for Deputy Secretary of Defense. I'm grateful to the committee for your stewardship of the National Defense Authorization Act over the past 60 years. Your effective bipartisan governance is a ballast for American national security. I want to thank you, Senator Shaheen, for your words of support. As the first woman elected to the Senate from the state of New Hampshire and the first woman to become that state's governor, you are a model to all those who aim to break barriers. And Secretary Gates, thank you for your generosity in introducing me today. It was an honor to work for you when you served as secretary, and if confirmed, I hope to follow your example of principled leadership. My deepest thanks go to my husband, Tom, whose love and support have been my anchor for 27 years. Our greatest joy is our 3 children, who teach me patience and humility routinely. I'm also grateful for my large and formidable Irish-American family. My parents' lifetime of service to the United States Navy set a standard of selflessness for all of us. I am honored to sit before you today in the hopes of carrying on that family legacy of service. If confirmed, I would be returning to a department where over much of the past 3 decades, I worked alongside dedicated women and men, civilian and military. I could not be prouder at the prospect of serving with them once more. The overriding mission of the Defense Department is to deter adversaries and defend the United States and her citizens. Challengers who seek to undermine America's interests by force should never doubt our resolve or readiness to thwart their aims. The Department is most effective when it is working in concert with other tools of national power. Our military strength bolsters the work of our diplomats, reinforces our alliances and partnerships, and strengthens our prosperity. If confirmed, foremost among my charges would be to help translate the rhetoric of strategic competition into the reality of execution. China is the pacing challenge of our time. Armed conflict between the United States and China is not desirable, and it is not inevitable. The U.S. military plays a critical role in preventing that outcome. We must stand ready today, and we must modernize if deterrence is to endure. If confirmed, I would seek to increase the speed and scale of innovation in our force. The Defense Department cannot do this alone. It must engage Congress, expand public-private partnerships, and work with America's allies and partners. Our greatest military strength is America's total force, supported by its military families. We must not forget that the Defense Department's workforce is America's workforce. The pandemic has tested the U.S. military just as it has tested all Americans. The Defense Department has a vested interest in leaning into COVID response efforts as President Biden has directed and Secretary Austin has committed. But most challenges facing the force and military families did not begin with COVID, and they will not disappear at its end. If confirmed, I will assist Secretary Austin in bringing enduring, consistent focus to total force health and quality. We must address suicide and mental health, housing, childcare, and food insecurity. We must root out violent extremism, systemic racism, sexual assault and harassment, and other inhibitors to readiness. And this is a matter of readiness. We will not be able to attract and retain the world's finest force, one that represents our democracy, if we cannot hold accountable those who threaten its viability from within. The Department must also manage its business operations efficiently and in line with performance goals. If confirmed, I would build on existing efforts to make clear and accountable progress toward a clean audit. I would also immediately assess the disposition of responsibilities previously assigned to the Chief Management Officer and make any adjustments needed. Our success in meeting these goals requires a regular and constructive dialogue between the Department and Congress. If confirmed, I will help Secretary Austin facilitate communication and exchange with you and your staff. The nation needs us to work together. Members of the committee, if confirmed, I would bring to these challenges a professional life spent committed to improving the nation's defense. I would bring an insider's knowledge of the levers for action and an outsider's drive for reform. I would bring a commitment to restoring healthy civil-military dynamics and establishing regular order. And I would be proud to put another crack in the glass ceiling of the department I've spent most of my adult life serving. Senators, I look forward to your questions and am grateful for this time with you today.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hicks. I'm going to cover 4 questions real quickly to kind of set this thing off. First of all, on the document that we referred to, the National Defense Strategy Commission, to me, that tells the whole world the significance of the 12 people who put this document together that we've adhered to. Some people are saying that it's maybe already outdated since that was put together back in 2018. I would ask the question, well, first of all, there are a lot of things that people keep talking about on the floor and about climate change, and yet nowhere in the Commission's analysis can I find that phrase. So in your view, and given your experience as a member of the NDS Commission, Does the 2018 NDS accurately assess the current strategic threat that we're faced with?
Senator, the 2018 NDS, I think, was a remarkable reflection of strong bipartisan consensus around the growing challenges presented by China in particular, and also the opportunistic challenges presented by Russia. And I think those factors continue to endure. The job of the National Defense Strategy Commission was to evaluate that NDS 2018. And Congress has established a requirement every 4 years for a new national defense strategy. I would imagine the Biden administration will be moving quickly to undertaking a full assessment, not only of the 2018 document and hopefully the Commission's recommendations, but also the current threat environment and other challenges we face. An example, in addition to climate, might be COVID, which did not appear in the 2018 document. The world changes, and we need to always be assessing our forces against the needs.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, one of the documents or statements in this this document is we would need to establish a real growth of 3 to 5%. Do you still think that's a good goal?
Senator, I think that was an accurate reflection of what it would take in a ballpark way to meet the requirements of the 2018 NDS as it was laid out. So I stand by that as the general rule of thumb for that document.
Okay, and I'm going to cover two other areas real quickly here. One, I'm going to quote from this NDS. Quote, civilian voices have been relatively muted on issues at the center of the U.S. defense and national security policy, undermining the concept of civilian control. And we talked to General Austin about this also. Would you give kind of what concrete steps would you recommend to correct this if you agree with this statement?
I do agree with that statement, and Secretary Austin, Senator, has laid out already in his confirmation hearing, and my understanding is in the steps he's implementing in the department, several concrete approaches. One is about who is in the room, who has a seat at the table, and whose voices are engaged in major issues of force deployment and force operations, as well as policy. And he's been very clear that, if confirmed, that would include me as the Deputy Secretary of Defense, his Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, when confirmed, would also be an important figure in that, alongside other civilian officials.
Very good. And lastly, I want to mention the nuclear triad. This is something that many people agree is the most significant problem that we are faced with right now. We have both Russia and China. They're modernizing and expanding their nuclear forces, as well as North Korea and some others that are moving in that direction also. Secretary Austin has recused himself potentially for the entirety of his term as Secretary of Defense from any matter involving Raytheon Technologies. So I understand that you will be making the decisions for DOD about the long-range standoff weapon, the ground-based support. I'd like to get you on record right now. Do you agree with the assessment of the past Secretaries of Defense, and I believe Secretary Austin as well, that the modernizing of the nation's nuclear forces is the most critical national security priority, and including, we're talking about the triad of land, air, and sea. Critics quite often talk about that as if that's you can get by with 2 out of 3, and I don't think you can. What's your thought?
Senator, I think first that nuclear deterrence is the cornerstone of American national security, as long as there are nuclear threats out there, and there certainly are those. I also think the triad has been, as Secretary Austin has put it, the bedrock of our nuclear deterrent. And I think it must be modernized in order to be safe, secure, credible. And I would just add that I am worried about the state of the readiness of the nuclear triad. And if confirmed, that's an area I would want to get my team in place and start to look at right away.
That's excellent. Thank you. Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Hicks. As I mentioned, transformation is going to be one of the key challenges you face, and I alluded to some of the obstacles. The services have favorite programs. There's an aversion, a risk aversion to gaps and capabilities, and then there's also congressional unwillingness to sacrifice platforms that might be beneficial to their locality. So can you give us an idea of what specific actions you might take to accelerate this transformation and the challenges you anticipate facing?
Senator, I think one of the major areas to look at are what are the incentives for the services, obviously members of Congress, industry, other stakeholders, and how do we work on improving the alignment of those incentives to get the kinds of outcomes we need for the joint warfighter. One major area that I would like to explore, if confirmed, is on concepts and joint concepts. The Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has an effort underway already in that area. I think we can create more incentives to ensure that what we are pursuing in terms of capabilities actually line up to theories of victory for how we are trying to pace challenges from China and Russia.
And alluding to China and Russia and the National Defense Strategy, as you indicated, it will be revised shortly by the Biden administration. Are there any assumptions that you feel might have changed since the last version, and also operational concepts? This is not a static situation. Much has happened in the last several years on both sides, or all sides, I should say. Are there any, again, assumptions that you might sort of question or operational concepts that have changed so that it has an impact on the next fourth statement?
Senator, I think I would, if confirmed, need to get in and really look at the threat assessments in terms of what we're seeing from China, Russia, and others, as well as how the advancement of U.S. capabilities is going. There are obviously programs that I am not privy to in my current capacity that I would want to understand better how they're being integrated into departments thinking about operational concepts. I would say in general terms, areas that concern me are quantum computing advances, hypersonic missile capabilities and technology, and challenges perhaps to the U.S. asymmetric advantages in the undersea domain.
Well, that's very sensible. And I think focusing on threats as a driver of policy is probably the best way to begin, or not only policy but operational dispositions and force structure. All of those will be affected by what the threat is. And I think, again, any analysis has to begin with the assumptions, make sure we have them right. One of the other aspects of our national security response is a whole of government response. I think the National Defense Strategy Report is very much focused on the Department of Defense and the military response, but we have to, I believe, have a much stronger whole of government effort. Can you comment on that?
Yes, Senator. If we look at the challenges being presented today, the good news is that our strategic deterrent, in the case of nuclear weapons, appears to be holding. The conventional deterrent appears to largely be holding. The result of that strength, which is good for the American people, is that adversaries have to look below the threshold of conventional conflict, and we are seeing that. There are different terms people use: malign influence, gray zone threats, but certainly China and Russia in their ways have been pursuing these. Many of the solutions to those gray zone challenges, which come in the form of economic coercion, cyber threats, as we've seen very recently from Russia, threats even in space, a lot of the answers to those start in the civil society side. They start with the strength of American democracy. They start with our tools of statecraft and how we build alliances and partnerships to counter them. And the Defense Department is typically in support for many of those challenges.
Well, Doctor, I'm glad you alluded to your Irish roots. Since we're both Irish, we understand that our favorite hobby is worrying. And after you worry about your children, I'm sure you're going to devote most of the day to worrying about the Department of Defense. So I'm very confident you'll do a good job. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Reid. Senator Wicker. Senator Wicker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'm glad there is more than one person worried in this room today. And thank you for your willingness to serve, and thank you for the conversation that we had early. I very much appreciate that. I enjoyed your testimony, and let me quote, China's military modernization is the pacing challenge of our time. Armed conflict between the United States and China is not desirable, and it is not inevitable. Would you also agree that it's not inconceivable?
I would agree with that, Senator.
Yes. Well, so let's worry about China, and particularly the Pacific, but also I want to ask you to be mindful of Russia and the Black Sea and that area of threat. Also, how do you view the growing imbalance of naval forces and missile systems between the United States and China?
Senator, I first believe the United States must have capable sea power. It must have a qualitative advantage over adversaries in order to achieve, protect its interest, advance its interest. I do want to just say, as an aside, that I thank this committee and the House Armed Services Committee for supporting the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. I think if confirmed, that's a tool that will be very helpful in building out some initiatives and capabilities in this area. My understanding from the outside, I'm not privy again to the information that's available were I to be confirmed, is that the Chinese have, of course, grown out the capacity of their Navy and their missile capability based in different domains, land-based, sea-based. And that's a very worrisome trend line. I'm concerned about the survivability of our naval forces, and I'm concerned about making sure we have them positioned and have a concept for operating them that can be a war-winning strategy. Okay,
the chairman had a conversation with you about the National Defense Strategy. That's now 3 years old and will be reviewed next year or perhaps earlier by the new administration. We have an FY22 30-year shipbuilding plan that was just released in December, so it's only 2 months old, and it calls for 405 manned ships by the year 2051. It would add 82 new ships between 2022 and 2026 at a cost of $147 billion. By comparison, the Navy's FY21 budget request projected to add only 44 ships as compared to 82 at a cost of $102 billion in the same time frame. In other words, the Navy's FY22 30-year shipbuilding plan shows an 86% increase in the number of ships the service would buy in the next 5 years, and a 44% increase in funding of the same time frame. Now, I think you told me that you've seen the non-classified part of this plan, but not the classified. You'll soon be confirmed and see the classified. How controlling do you view this 30-year shipbuilding plan, which came from the previous administration, and what do you plan to prioritize with regard to shipbuilding in the Defense Department?
Senator, let me first say, from the plan that was released by the Trump administration in December, there's some really interesting operational themes that I'm attracted to. There's a focus on increasing use of autonomy. There's a focus on dispersal of forces, and there's a focus on growing the number of small surface combatants relative to today. But there are some things in that unclassified report, as I mentioned to you, that I saw as flags. There's an indication that the information in there would require further analysis to validate the numbers. So if confirmed, I would want to get in there, get my team together, certainly start to get our leadership for the Navy put in place on the civilian side, and assess in accordance with the requirements that Congress has established for an FY22 shipbuilding plan, assess that last document from the Trump administration and make any adjustments necessary. Just wanted to add that I would absolutely welcome, if confirmed, the opportunity to work with members of this committee to talk through what we are seeing as we're thinking ahead to what that shipbuilding plan should be.
Okay, we will have further conversations about that, and I appreciate it. I also appreciate the fact that in a foreign affairs piece you wrote, you stress that the U.S. will need to keep forces deployed overseas, especially in Asia and Europe. I agree with that. Much as we might like to have savings there, I think really the long-term savings and the long-term deterrence calls for that to continue. I'm going to ask you to briefly discuss if you've looked at the 2 additional destroyers at Rota, Spain, that are in the works at this point.
Senator, I haven't looked at the decision-making around that deployment. I'm aware that both of the value of Rota, and it's something that I would want to look into as part of a holistic look, not only at our maritime presence, but our overall global posture to make sure we have the right forces in the right places for the kinds of contingencies we anticipate.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Senator Wicker. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you. Again, welcome. We're delighted that you're here. And we had the opportunity several weeks ago to talk about some of the challenges you will face if confirmed at DOD. And I was very parochial in that call because I talked about the critical aspects of New Hampshire's economy and our contributions to our national security. One of those is the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, which is between New Hampshire and Maine. And Senator Wicker talks about the importance of the shipbuilding plan, but that shipbuilding plan is only going to work as well as we have the capacity to make sure that our ships and subs are modernized and restored whenever something happens and we can keep them sailing. And I wonder if you can discuss the importance of the Navy shipyard infrastructure optimization plan, which is so important. Right now we're seeing a dramatic increase in dry dock capacity because of that plan at Portsmouth.
Thank you, Senator. I do think the sustainability, it's not just the shipbuilding, it's the sustainability of our fleet. And both of those aspects are incredibly important. We need to have modernized depot capacity and capability to include in our naval shipyards. So I agree that it's greatly important. I would need to, if confirmed, understand better how well the optimization plan is working. But I do think it appears from the outside that it's a step in the right direction to make sure we have that sustainable capacity.
Well, good. We'd love to have you come up and see it firsthand in Portsmouth, where we think it's working very well. We also talked about the 157th Air Refueling Wing that's at Pease Air National Guard Base, which you pointed out your husband had spent some time in at Pease when it was the former SAC command. And we're very proud that we were the first guard base to get those KC-46 tankers. Now, as you know, because of a variety of challenges, including the most recent related to the remote vision system, we are still waiting on those tankers to be operational. So will you commit to continuing to do everything you can to ensure that Boeing gets us those tankers operational as soon as possible?
I will, Senator.
Thank you very much. We also talked about the role of women in defense, and I pointed out, as you already knew, the passage of the Women, Peace, and Security Act, which is designed to try and make better use of the role that women can play, particularly in conflict zones around the world. Can you talk about why you think that's important?
Absolutely. Senator Shaheen, first I want to thank you for your work on the Women, Peace, and Security legislation. The evidence that exists to date indicates that when women are engaged in peace and security matters, that negotiated settlements and viable and enduring negotiated settlements are more likely to come out. What I understand the Defense Department has done already to put into place the legislative requirements is to have senior advisors at each of the combatant commands and some additional staffing within the Office of the Secretary of Defense. I think those are important steps. If confirmed, I would want to be able to understand how well that's working and what kind of voice those advisors and the folks who are staffing the Secretary of Defense have in major considerations of peace and security.
Well, thank you. I look forward to working with you on that. In response to, I think it was Senator Reed's question about how do we how do we look at some of the big investments that we've made that may no longer be what we need to address the current times? You talked about changing the incentives that we have. Can you shed a little more light on, give me some examples of how you think that would work?
Sure. Inside the Defense Department, an example is that when a system, if you will, is reduced in number or money is shifted, that the service that has, given up the capacity or the capability often believes that they will lose out overall, and the incentive structure is built around budget share. I think, first of all, we should make clear always from a leadership perspective that the incentive is about serving the joint warfighter. And we need to make sure we're hiring and promoting, particularly in the senior general officer and flag officer ranks and our career civilians, that perspective. So the incentives start around promotion, but they also include how we keep the money, if you will, oriented towards services who are putting forward good ideas, even if those good ideas seem to go against a vested interest. I think when you're talking beyond the Defense Department, first the incentive and engagements between the department and Congress have to do with having a dialogue and not the department presenting its own fait accompli upon Congress. I think instead it's about a dialogue of how we move these joint capabilities forward and what kinds of approaches can be taken to help communities, to help different parts of the design base or manufacturing base. Sometimes those solutions might be internal to DoD, and sometimes they might be about other initiatives across the U.S. government, and that's where DoD will need to work closely with its partners in the Department of Commerce and other state and local governments, small business initiatives, to make sure we are part of the, as President Biden puts it, the Build Back Better set of initiatives.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. Now, via WebEx, Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Hicks, I appreciated our discussion of the importance of nuclear modernization yesterday, and I'd like to revisit a few of the questions in order to confirm your support for the record. First, I do thank you for that support for maintaining an effective nuclear triad of land, air, and sea-based platforms. Do you also support modernizing this triad as well as the infrastructure at the Department of Energy and the command and control networks on which our nuclear forces depend?
I do.
And do you believe the reemergence of great power competition makes nuclear deterrence and therefore nuclear modernization increasingly important compared to previous eras?
I think it makes it, remains the cornerstone.
Do you believe reductions in nuclear forces should be made pursuant to a negotiated, verifiable agreement? In other words, not unilaterally.
I do, Senator.
And do you believe the costs of our nuclear forces, which including modernization, sustainment, and operations, would consume less than 6.5% of the department budget at their peak, and that is manageable?
Senator, I think our decisions on nuclear weapons should be driven foremost by strategy.
Thank you. Dr. Hicks, with the change in the administration, opponents of nuclear weapons are renewing their arguments against elements of the triad and modernization programs, in particular the ICBM leg and the associated modernization program known as the GBSD. In 2012, when you were in the department, this committee was considering your nomination to be the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Policy. You stated in a written response for the record, quote, "Single warhead ICBMs contribute to stability," end quote. Is that still your view?
Senator Fisher, may I ask you to repeat the statement? I couldn't hear the quote.
Okay. The quote was, "Single warhead ICBMs contribute to stability."
I do agree with that statement.
Some advocates are calling on the president to put modernization programs on pause while they are reviewed. I find this especially concerning because what sounds like an innocent concept has the potential to break the recapitalization schedule. We've repeatedly heard from STRATCOM commanders that there is no additional margin in the schedule for further delay. Admiral Richard, the current STRATCOM commander, in his posture statement last year testified, quote, "Many of the modernization and sustainment efforts necessary to ensure the deterrence viability have zero schedule margin and are late to need," end quote. And he went on to state, quote, "We cannot afford more delays and uncertainty in delivering capabilities, and we must maintain a focus on revitalizing our nuclear forces and associated infrastructure," end quote. That's been the consistent message since the Obama administration. We have already delayed and we have deferred these programs as much as possible. And if we don't proceed with urgency, these capabilities will age out and their replacements, they won't be available. That's something the last two administrations found completely unacceptable. Do you agree that allowing these capabilities to age into obsolescence is unacceptable?
Yeah, Senator, I was having a little trouble hearing you. I think the way I would respond to that is that I am concerned, again, about the modernization of the force. I very much respect Admiral Richards. I think STRATCOM has an important voice at this table, should be respected and listened to. If confirmed, I would need to get in and understand exactly what the status is and, to your point, the margin of error. I don't think we should be risking the modernization of our deterrent where that modernization actually challenges the quality of our strategic deterrent.
And Dr. Hicks, our nuclear weapons production infrastructure, much of it dates back to World War II era Manhattan Project. It's atrophied to the point where the United States is the only nuclear armed country in the world without the ability to produce a new weapon. Do you believe that the United States must rebuild and maintain the basic capabilities to design, manufacture, and sustain an effective nuclear weapons stockpile to support our nation's deterrent?
I do.
Thank you. I see my time's almost up. I appreciate your thoughtfulness. I appreciate your knowledge, and I look forward to you serving in this capacity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your service to our nation, Dr. Hicks. I want to join in thanking former Secretary Gates as well as my colleague, Senator Shaheen, for their excellent introductions, and welcome your husband, Tom, as well as possibly your two sisters in West Hartford and your brother in New Haven, if they are listening. If not, please convey my regards to them. And they must be very proud of you, as is your whole family, for your very distinguished service. I want to just begin with a comment because I read your remarks on the issue of sexual assault, which are very general. I will just be very blunt. As you know, this committee is accustomed to hearing very general remarks on this issue. For as long as I've been in the Senate, which is now 10 years, we've been hearing the same kind of generalities. And I don't mean to be rude, but sometimes they sound like good intentions, but a lot less action than there should be. So I'm hoping that your commitment on that issue will be sincere, vigorous, and aggressive, as I expect it will be. Likewise, on the issue of white supremacy, I'm very heartened by the remarks made by Secretary Austin, as well as yourself, on this issue, because I think that extremist ideology in the military, as in any other phase of life, has to be fought and overcome. I want to focus on the issue of the defense industrial base. As you and I discussed yesterday, the number of suppliers, for example, in the submarine program has diminished substantially over recent years, from about 17,000 in the period of a couple of decades ago to now 5,000, a 70% decrease. Those numbers come from a recent GAO report. I raised them yesterday in a call with Electric Boat. They are extremely alarming to me. Your remarks indicate your commitment to aiding the small suppliers who are now struggling as a result of the pandemic and the economic crisis, but also developing new suppliers, returning the numbers of small startups and medium-sized companies. And you remark that efforts so far have, quote, not yet led to the level of dynamism in the industrial base that we need, end quote. So I'm hoping that you will focus on the supply chain that is so vitally important to major contractors like Electric Boat or Raytheon or any of our major sources of supply.
Yes, Senator, if I may step back to address the first part of your comments on sexual assault, I can assure you as a woman in modern American workplace and certainly in national security, I too get tired of hearing a lot of talk that doesn't convert into actual change. I am very heartened by the fact that President Biden moved out quickly on this issue with his 90-day effort, and then Secretary Austin moved out himself inside the department with his memo. I was absolutely appalled, and I think anyone who reads that Fort Hood report would feel the same as I do at the failures we've experienced to date on sexual assault. And I think all good ideas should be on the table. We shouldn't be taking things off the table while we're looking for the best solutions. On your point about consolidation of the industrial base, yes, I am concerned. Some consolidation is probably inevitable. The Defense Department isn't sized, if you will, in many areas to maintain a large base. But extreme consolidation does create challenges for innovation. My point on dynamism, you need to have a lot of different good ideas out there. That's our comparative advantage over authoritarian states like China and Russia. And so if we move all competition out, obviously that's a challenge both for the taxpayer, but it's also a challenge in terms of the innovation piece. So I would be happy, if confirmed, Senator, to work with you and your team on ways we can look at key parts of the industrial base and how we ensure there's a healthy supply chain.
Thank you very much. Just one last question on the issue of climate change and energy efficiency. You and I discussed this issue at some length. We don't have time today to continue that conversation, but I do hope to continue it. And very excitingly, you mentioned the idea of our fleet going possibly to electric power. Not surprising, given that automobile manufacturers are moving inexorably and quickly in that direction. GM very shortly will have an all-electric fleet, and maybe the Department of Defense can pursue that initiative as well. I see no reason why the Department of Defense can't have a fleet of vehicles that is all electric within the very foreseeable future. Would you agree?
Yes, President Biden in his executive order last week included a requirement on electric vehicle fleets, and if confirmed, that would be something I would want to work on right away to determine the viability of that, the timeline for that for DOD.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Now via WebEx, Senator Cotton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mrs. Hicks, Dr. Hicks, for your appearance today, and congratulations on your nomination. I guess I'm heartened by what I've heard you say to Senator Inhofe and Senator Fisher about our nuclear triad and our nuclear strategic deterrent, and with Senator Fisher in particular about the ground-based strategic deterrent, the replacement for the Minuteman III. I do want to get a little more specific about that because it's 50 years old, and we've seen problems with structural fatigue and water intrusion and decayed wiring. The GAO has warned that we could lose confidence in the fleet by 2026, a mere 5 years from now. Congress has fully funded the GBSD, its replacement system, and both military and civilian leaders have consistently warned that the service life extension of the Minuteman III is no longer an option. Given that we have, until recent years, put off nuclear modernization for so long, and the threats rising with China's crashed nuclear buildup, and Russia's unconstrained tactical weapon inventory, Dr. Hicks, I wanted to know if you will fully commit to the deployment of the GBSD on its planned schedule.
Senator, I'll say again that I believe the triad has been a bedrock for American security, and I am a big believer in the value of the nuclear deterrent. What I can't say today, and until I have an opportunity, if I'm confirmed, to get in and understand the state, just as you are describing the state of the various legs of the triad, in this case, the state of the land-based component, it's difficult for me to assess exactly what the timeline and the margin, if you will, is, and also the technical feasibility issues, not just resource issues, but technical feasibility issues. But what I can promise is I am committed to a modernized, qualitatively effective deterrent. And if confirmed, I'd be happy to work with members here on a discussion around what we're seeing and what those timelines look like, and making sure that the FY22 budget pushes forward the President's commitment to that nuclear deterrent at the same time that it's promoting America's nonproliferation agenda.
That commitment to the deterrent includes the ground-based leg of the deterrent, correct?
Yes, Senator, I believe that our deterrent is strongest as a triad. I understand that there will be a relook, as there is in every administration, at the various aspects of nuclear policy and modernization. I think that's appropriate. The Trump administration did that as well. But if you're asking my personal view, my view is that the triad has served us very well. It has created stability, and it has a value.
And I can understand your hesitation to make the commitment of the deployment on time, given the Pentagon's long history of many programs running over time and over budget. So let's divide the reasons in half why you wouldn't make that commitment. One is the policy reason that some in the administration, some in the Democratic Party, don't want to modernize the missile leg of triad. And then there's all the concerns about, as you say, the technical feasibility, where the program is, its financing, and so forth. Is it the second concern that you have that causes you to hesitate towards making commitment towards on-time delivery as opposed to the first, the ideological or the policy one?
Senator, as a nominee for Deputy Secretary of Defense, I probably think of myself mostly in the former category in general. Yes, I would be very much focused on the viability of the programming element of this, and I would be in support of the Secretary, of course, on the major policy issues regarding nuclear posture, where he seeks my advice. But as I said in my opening statement, I think my job is to make sure we can execute on the President's direction and on Secretary Austin's direction.
Okay. Well, if confirmed, I certainly hope that'll be a very top priority to make sure all those programmatic issues permit for the on-time deployment of something critical to our national security. Dr. Hicks, you suggested something in your answer that I want to touch on as well, about a posture review. Will the Biden administration conduct a nuclear posture review, as has been the custom for the last several new presidential administrations?
Senator Cotton, that is my understanding. I don't, because I'm not inside the administration, I don't know the status of that, but it is my understanding that there is an intention to review nuclear posture as well as, of course, overall defense strategy. The latter part is a congressionally mandated requirement.
Thank you. One final question. Like all administrations in the nuclear age, to include the Obama administration, will the Biden administration decline to adopt a no first use policy for nuclear weapons?
Senator, I can't speak to how the Biden administration might ultimately come through its policy assessments with regard to either nuclear declaratory policy or other issues. I have been on the record in the past as not being, I don't believe no first use policy is necessarily in the best interest of the United States, but those will be decisions ultimately made, of course, by the President.
Well, thank you. I hope you'll be a vocal voice for that and that people will listen to you.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Now, via WebEx, Senator Gillibrand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much, Doctor, for being here. I want to continue along the line of argument that I listened to from Senator Blumenthal. You did say that you've reviewed the Fort Hood investigative report. in that report, there was a significant recommendation, and it said that commander negligence at Fort Hood fostered a culture of violent crime, sexual assault, and harassment. The investigators provided a solution, quote, to ensure objectivity and fairness, the Sexual Harassment and Assault Response, or SHARP program, should operate independent from local commands and their legal advisors. Dr. Hicks, do you think that if local commanders are not trusted to oversee SHARP, that they should still get to decide which sexual assaults and complex criminal cases should go forward to be prosecuted?
Senator Gillibrand, let me just first thank you for your leadership in general on this issue. As the Fort Hood report makes very clear, even just in the one excerpt you've given, this is a problem that doesn't appear to be getting any better. And we need to be really open, I think, on the solutions, the levers that will actually make a difference. I am not a legal expert. I can't speak to the specifics of how the department at this point, you know, without being in the department, how the department ought to move forward on those recommendations, and in particular on the accountability side, prosecution and accountability side. But what I can say is that to the extent that Secretary Austin is involving me in decisions relating to countering sexual assault and harassment in the military, that I'm very open to ideas, even if they include removing the commander from that prosecution chain.
Mm-hmm. And the purpose of that would be to give the prosecution to trained military prosecutors who have had time to develop expertise in criminal law. Because right now, fewer cases are proceeding to trial and fewer cases are ending in conviction. And so as a result, we've seen a lessening of people's faith in the system. And the one recommendation that survivors and legal expert and advocates have recommended is allowing the professionalization of the prosecution of major crimes that have jail time of more than a year. And so that's why this is the recommendation. And for your benefit, we've put forward pretty much every other recommendation that the DOD has supported and turned it into law, and they have not changed these outcomes. And the second thing that doesn't seem to matter is whether a Secretary of Defense takes this seriously or not, because every single one of them has said they've taken it seriously from Dick Cheney on. And so promises, empty promises, are something that I hope the Biden administration does not tolerate. And I would like your commitment that you will really focus on this issue to make sure that we get to the right result, where we can have a military justice system that is worthy of the sacrifices that the men and the women in our services make every single day.
Senator, you have that commitment.
Okay. I'd like to address now issues of cybersecurity. Last month, it came to light that Russia had created a backdoor into computers of at least 250 agencies for 9 months, and possibly still, they've been able to monitor computer activity and steal data that has come to our attention. So a private company, FireEye, brought that to our attention, not the DOD. This comes only after 2 years that our cyber posture review found that we've had difficulties with DoD cyberspace operations' ability to prevent malign activity from our adversaries. Now, we've had several hearings on this, and we've had lots of proposed changes. One proposal is to increase the role of the National Guard so that cybersecurity experts can maintain their day jobs while also serving the country. Do you think this is a tool that could be useful for this problem?
Senator, I think the National Guard can bring specialized capabilities in exactly these types of areas where the commercial sector, to your point about FireEye, where the commercial sector is sometimes out in front of the federal government. So it does seem to be at first glance that the National Guard could be helpful in this area.
Last, I wanted to touch on diversity. Recently, the DoD released a 2017 survey that showed 24.4% of active duty minority service members experienced harassment or discrimination, but only 26% reported their experience to the Equal Opportunity Program. Only 16% of reports led to punishment of the perpetrator, and 10% somehow led to punishment of the reporter. While interviewing Anthony Brown last July, you stated the military is a, quote, engine to counter racism. With statistics like this, do you think that engine is actually working? And would you agree that service members should have the same ability to report discrimination without reprisal as a civilian DoD employee?
Senator, I hesitate to get into specific recommendations related to UCMJ or other legal matters. If confirmed, I would absolutely want to speak to the career lawyers to understand what the implications are. But to your general point, I think it is crystal clear that the military has not undertaken sufficient efforts on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that we have a major leadership challenge, quite frankly. We have a problem on the prevention side, and we clearly have a problem on holding folks accountable, whether it's sexual harassment and assault or it's DEI-related issues more broadly. And I am committed to making sure we make genuine progress. I know it's difficult to hear nominee after nominee come up and say that, but you have my commitment, and I would look forward to working with you on both of these sets of issues.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Gillibrand. And via WebEx, Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Hicks, thank you for your years of service and the work that you've done in national security issues. I want to thank you for your willingness to serve once again in such an important position. I enjoyed our phone call last week, and I want you to know that I intend to support your nomination. I do have a couple of questions that I'd like to go through with you, specifically with regard to our DoD cyber strategy, which had been published back in December of 2018, which charges the DoD to defend forward, shape the day-to-day competition, and prepare for war. The United States Cyber Command has demonstrated successful instances of defend forward in securing the 2018 and 2020 elections. What are your views on the defend forward, shape the day-to-day competition, and prepare for war concepts to deter and disrupt Russia and China in cyberspace?
Senator, first, thank you very much for your support of my nomination. I have had an opportunity at different periods in the last several years to get a little more information on what's behind Defend Forward. I would say, based on the briefings that I have had, I am supportive of the approach. I think if confirmed, what I would like to understand better is exactly how the authorities are being executed, what kind of oversight is involved, how we are consulting with allies and partners, whose systems we might operate on. I think those are very important questions for civilian policymakers to be engaged on. But in general, I believe that we have had to become much more forward-leaning in our approach. And I also think Congress has a critical role to play here in terms of authorities. And I would want to understand better, again, how it's being executed today to engage in a dialogue about what is the appropriate role for Congress and for civilians, policymakers in the executive branch.
I'm also very pleased by the progress that we've made enabling Cybercom to rapidly conduct cyber effects operations to include offensive cyber operations. Can you tell the American people why this is so important to our national defense? I think it's important that the public understand that we've got challenges with people attacking us, but we have to be in a position to offer offensive cyber operations even when we're not in an identified conflict.
Yes, Senator, I think one of the major challenges about thinking through competition or confrontations in cyberspace is that the classic definitions of what is offense and what is defense are very blurred. And so it is challenging to use the kind of constructs we've thought of in a terrestrial sense in cyberspace. What I would say to your point is the way in which adversaries can come at our systems, and the recent Russian hacks, to include through SolarWinds, demonstrated this, is they can live in our systems for some time. They can undertake espionage, extract information, and then can turn, in many cases, onto what we would think of as offensive approaches. In order for the U.S. to prevent that and deter that, it also sometimes has to defend forward. That is to say, it has to be living in systems so that it has the warning, the indicators and warning to know that an attack is imminent. And that's where this offensive piece becomes important.
Exactly. And not only that, but it also provides us with advance warning about the type that might very well be used, because if they're using those tactics in other countries in advance, they may very well be using the same tactics when it comes to trying to get into our systems as well. As we discussed during our call, there was an effort in the last administration to end the Cybercom NSA dual hat. Again, I've been watching this issue for a number of years now, and I'm really concerned by that. I had originally come in thinking that it would be appropriate to split them up rather quickly. I've changed my mind. I think that the dual hat, with the unity of command it provides, is working very well for the current and likely for future Cybercom commanders. Now, separating the two organizations could create some real problems with regard to the assets that would have to be acquired in addition to what we have today. Would you please share your thoughts on this with the committee?
Yes, Senator, I don't have a position on the ultimate disposition of the dual hat arrangement for Cybercom and NSA. I do have an assessment based on my work on the transition team looking at where we are today, and particularly in light of this recent hack that included exploitation of the SolarWinds software. And that is that we are not at a maturation point now with Cybercom that makes the dual an end to the dual hat arrangement wise in the immediate. And if confirmed, I would be happy to continue, of course, looking at this issue and giving Secretary Austin my best advice on, if there comes a point where that does seem to be, the split does seem to be wise.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Rounds. Now, via WebEx, Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Dr. Hicks. Thank you for chatting with me the other day. I start with the following two questions of every nominee who comes before any of the committees on which I sit. First question, since you became an adult, have you ever made unwanted requests for sexual favors or committed any verbal or physical harassment or assault of a sexual nature?
No.
Have you ever faced discipline or entered into a settlement related to this kind of conduct?
No.
I note in your responses to questions from my colleagues that you recognize the importance of the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, and that includes the importance of the compacts that we have with the freely associated states of Micronesia, Palau, and Marshall Islands. I believe that we can do more in our partnerships with them, and I hope that you will be open to, for example, Palau has asked us to invest in joint use facilities such as airfields and airfields. So I hope that you'll be open to doing more with our important partners in the Pacific.
Senator, I am open to that.
I do applaud Secretary Austin's recent announcement that the Pentagon will prioritize climate change considerations in its activities, risk assessments, and in the next National Defense Strategy. I believe that renewable energy is not simply an environmental calculation, but it is becoming a tactical necessity for the DoD, which is the biggest user of energy in our government. So we have included provisions in NDAA to prioritize energy security and resilience at military installations. And I'd like to know whether you will make energy resilience and mission assurance a priority for the DoD.
Yes, Senator. I think the resiliency aspects on climate are critical as a business proposition for DoD, again, focused really, if you just take a hard-nosed resource look at it. And I want to commend Congress for reestablishing the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy Installations and Environment. If confirmed, I would work with Secretary Austin to ensure that we put forward a nominee who's very capable and competent in these exact spaces.
I think the issue of energy resilience and all of that is we have to stay the course. Senator Shaheen had asked you about the importance of our shipyards, and she said it's a parochial concern, but it is not. I view it as a national concern, and of course I chatted with you about the importance of the 4 public shipyards, of which there is one in Hawaii. And so the modernization of these shipyards is a very important concern for a number of us, and I hope that I have your commitment that you will continue to support the funding for the modernization of our shipyards. Because it's, as you acknowledge, it's not enough to just build ships. We actually have to repair and maintain them.
Yes, I agree completely, Senator. The sustainability of all of our forces, frankly, especially if you look at where the cost curves are on operations and sustainment, that's going to be vital if we're going to compete effectively in the future.
Senator Blumenthal and Gillibrand have asked you questions about the continuing scourge of sexual assault harassment, and I would include retaliation on the basis of reporting, somebody who reports these kinds of actions. And it continues to be a scourge, as I mentioned, and every secretary, every deputy, everybody who comes before us from DOD says that you will do something about it. So I'd like to know, what would be measures of progress in this area? How would you determine whether real progress is being made to eliminate or reduce the scourge of sexual assault, harassment, and retaliation?
Senator, I think first, one of the most important tools we could have is transparency and data. And as you are likely aware, the department has not collected recent data with regard to reporting on sexual harassment, or we know how many claims, if you will, have been made, but we don't know the totality of the reporting. If you look again at the Fort Hood report, if you look at that microcosm of the Fort Hood community, it was very clear. It was significant underreporting underway. And so I think that's an area we'd want to look at right away in terms of making clear that reporting does not have negative consequences for the career of anyone in the total force, civilians, contractors, or military. And that there are tools, easy tools, hotlines that are easy to use, that everyone knows about, that the training is there. And then I would just add sort of the training element. A lot of these harassment is often the grooming process toward assault. So we have to look at both of those issues. And a lot of this is happening in the youngest of our service members. And that means there's training opportunities. That means there's leadership opportunities at every level. And we need to be making sure we're holding folks accountable at the same time we're putting the resources into prevention.
That's why it's important to have sexual harassment as a separate charge in these matters. And maybe another way to determine the extent of the problem is to poll your service members themselves as to whether they have experienced sexual harassment, assault, etc., including, by the way, asking them about racial discrimination. I believe my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Rono. Now via WebEx, Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Hicks, thank you for being there. I want to also thank you for being so generous with your time on the phone call last week. We covered a number of different topics. I did want to get back to some of the discussion we had last week, particularly around the on the one hand, I like all the responses you've given to my colleagues on commitment to modernization and our defense strategy. On the other hand, I think we're going to come up with funding issues and challenges to keep those programs on track. So how do we, when you go into this role, and I intend to support your confirmation, how do you look at getting more productivity out of the dollars we already have in the face of the economic challenges that we have, and maybe an administration that wouldn't place the same priority on funding that you've seen over the last 4 years? How do you get more productivity? What kind of department-wide programs do you think are appropriate to drive more productivity for the dollars being spent?
First, Senator, thank you so much for your statement of support, and I enjoyed our conversation as well. Let me tackle a few aspects of that because it's not an easy answer. I think some of the elements are about tying the capabilities, the programs to capabilities to concepts to what we're trying to achieve, and that concept to capability link has been weak in the department for some time. Again, the department has some work underway. If confirmed, I'd want to get in particular, talk to the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff about the status of that effort and try to understand where the concepts are driving us to ideas about how we perform in the field against challengers. That helps us really focus the mind on the priorities we need to have in terms of what deters effectively, what creates credible capability, and also, where are there areas that are lower risk? There's never a lack of risk. The question is how to prioritize effectively and be transparent about where we have decided to take risk so that Congress, among others, can make its own determinations about those judgments. I think the other thing I would just point to is the business operations side of DoD. I mentioned in my opening statement that that's an area the Deputy Secretary
have the bias that what we have to do is go in and stratify some of these acquisition processes that are literally preventing some viable suppliers from even participating because they're so costly and so time consuming that we can get a richer supply base, I think, if we get smarter on certain systems. Clearly on more complex leading edge technologies, it may take time, but I think all of them have to have enough and down review. Dr. Hicks, I also just want to go back and associate myself with some of the comments made by Senator Blumenthal and Senator Gillibrand on military sexual assault. I suspect that that's going to be a priority in her position as chair of the Personnel Subcommittee. And I'm very frustrated with some of the confidence that I've placed in the department to make progress and not seeing the kind of progress. And I think the Fort Hood review says a lot, needs to be acted on. The final question I have for you is just your assessment of our NATO relationship and our partners. What challenges or what can we build on based on the prior administration?
Senator, I think the U.S. transatlantic relationship manifested most fully in NATO in the military sphere is absolutely vital to any of the challenges we think of in the future. Even when we think about China as the pacing challenge, our relations with our European allies is critical to our effectiveness, our ability to build out a community of democracies that can counter authoritarian approaches. So I see NATO as a centerpiece of our alliance networks throughout the world. I have been concerned, I have written on my concern that the focus on burden sharing, and we should always be focused on burden sharing, ensuring that allies fulfill their commitments, but that when it becomes that tactical issue, it overrides the strategic value of the alliances alliances that the Chinese and Russians could only hope to match. We have if we get to that point, we have become astrategic, and I'm very hopeful that President Biden, who has spoken eloquently on this issue, will make good progress in returning strategy to the center of our alliance relations.
Thank you, Alex. I look forward to working with you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Tillis. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Dr. Hicks, congratulations on your nomination. A couple of topics. First on sexual assault in the military. When we grappled with this issue in a major way in 2013, and we've sort of been building upon that since, there were basically three categories of SASC members. There were those who felt this problem was so serious that the only solution to it was to remove it from the chain of command. There were those who felt that the problem was deeply serious and we needed to make the chain of command work to solve it. And then there was a third group into which I, Senator King, some others around the table were in this group. We knew it was serious. We wanted to give the chain of command an opportunity to solve it. But if we were unhappy with results, we were very willing to go the path of taking out of the chain of command. I just sort of want to put on the record that that third group of members of this committee, virtually all of us are really unhappy with the progress since 2013. We're now getting to 8 years from then. And we were willing to give the chain of command new tools, new resources, new accountability mechanisms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we're not happy with the outcome. And so I think it's just important for the Pentagon community to know that that was sort of a swing block in 2013 that led us to go down a particular path. But many of us who were supporting those within the chain of command improvements have been very dissatisfied with the results. And we're now very open to pursuing a different path, as we said we would at the time. That's number one. Number two, here's an accomplishment that is an Obama and Trump era accomplishment that's also an accomplishment of this committee and the Pentagon. Pressure for the Pentagon finally to do an audit, like every other federal agency, and to have every function of the Pentagon and every part of the Pentagon audited. We did that because an audit is a good oversight tool for this committee. An audit is a good accounting tool for the numbers folks at the Pentagon, but we also did it because an audit should be a good management tool for folks like you. Tell this committee how you will use the audit in your role should you be confirmed.
Well, thank you, Senator. My understanding from the team that's in the abide by and is advantaged by. I think it is also pointed more generally to the value of data. And as we move into an era of data, the department needs to move there too. And the audit is showing the way to how data can be leveraged to make more sound analytic decisions.
I hope you'll continue that focus. Any dollar or energy we spend on something unnecessary or ineffective is a dollar that we're not spending on these real challenges we have before us. Last question is this. There are positions still to be named in the Biden administration, undersecretaries of defense for acquisition and sustainment and research and engineering. Many of the nominees and appointments for DoD spots thus far are veterans of the Obama administration, local think tanks, advocacy groups, all of which is important, but none thus far have extensive acquisition or industry experience. The department was well served, in my opinion, by some previous officials like Secretaries Lord, Gertz, McCarthy, who had sizable acquisition experience before their appointments. If confirmed, do you have any sense of where the department will look to fill up the ranks of the A&S and R&E portfolios so that we'll have acquisition and research expertise in a Biden Pentagon?
Senator, Secretary Austin, when he was nominee, Austin and I spoke quite a bit about those particular positions. And then, of course, you have the service acquisition executives who have increased responsibilities in these areas. And I know from Secretary Austin, this is among his highest priorities in terms of positions to fill in the near term. I can't speak on his behalf about the particulars of individuals, but I can tell you that the attributes I know that the department needs is that acquisition expertise, is a familiarity with the hardware and software ends of where the department's capabilities are coming from, and a really fine-tuned sense of how to work in new ways with industry to some of the issues that have already been raised. There are significant challenges to non-traditional defense players getting into the marketplace. We need to lower those if we're going to compete successfully.
Thank you, Dr. Hicks. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Kane. Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Dr. Hicks, congratulations on your nomination, and appreciated the opportunity to chat the other day, and really, sorry, I'm looking at my time here. Appreciate your background and our discussion. I'm going to follow up on that on a number of the topics. Of course, I raised the issue of the Arctic and Alaska's place as we're an Arctic nation because of my great state. Can I get your commitment, if confirmed, that you'll get up to Alaska and see the importance of the Arctic and our strategic location there?
Senator, I would welcome coming to Alaska.
Good. Well, you know, Billy Mitchell, the father of the U.S. Air Force, called Alaska the most strategic place in the world. But I have a new quote that I'm going to start using. The now Secretary of Defense, in his confirmation hearing, Secretary Austin said, "I absolutely agree that Alaska is a national treasure, and it holds some of the most important military assets and resources." Would you agree with your future boss?
I do.
On that? Okay, good. One of the things that he did say, as we have been pressing the Pentagon, which, as I've told you and firmly believe, the Pentagon's been asleep at the switch on the strategic nature of the Arctic, the national defense strategy, the great power competition is literally taking place there as we speak, Russia, China, others. No offense, not really the Pentagon. The services have now gotten serious about service strategies. Secretary Austin committed to fully resourcing these service strategies as it relates to the Arctic. Can I get your commitment on that as well?
Senator, I'm certainly committed to making sure we have the capabilities we need in the Arctic.
Great, thank you. Let me turn to what I think is a real simple question, but to be honest, I'm having a hard time with some of the incoming Biden cabinet officials to commit to this. In your personal opinion, the United States, I want your personal opinion on this, from a national security and foreign policy perspective, we have once again become the world's energy superpower because of states like New Mexico and North Dakota and Alaska. We're the largest producer prior to the pandemic, largest producer of oil, natural gas, and renewables in the world. Is that good for our national security and foreign policy?
It is, Senator.
And on the other hand, becoming more reliant on countries like Russia or Venezuela for our oil and gas needs, is that good for our national security or is that bad?
Generally speaking, it's bad.
So here's what I would ask as a commitment. I can't seem to get a commitment from any cabinet official in the Biden administration to be a strong proponent of.
Generally speaking, think of the role in order to bring business process efficiency and business transformation to the department. You need components and leaders at every level dedicated to making sure the return to taxpayer is appropriate, and again, that the focus is on the joint warfighter and providing what that warfighter needs today and in the future. So I think there are some shared responsibilities, but to the extent that the deputy is the chief operating officer, that position bears the brunt of the responsibility and focus. The current Deputy Secretary of Defense has put forward a memo with the abolishment of the CMO position that lays out the disposition of the responsibilities formally assigned to the CMO. If confirmed, I would want to look at the decision-making behind that memo, understand why he made those decisions, and make my own assessment about whether those are the right places to put those responsibilities. And I would look forward to an opportunity to coming back and speaking with you, Senator King, and others who are interested in this space to make sure that we're set up for success on the functions, as you point out, that need to carry forward.
My concern is that if you have many people responsible, no one's responsible. And one of my philosophies of management is I like to have one throat to choke. That is someone who is accountable. I hope you will consider having in your office a person who's specially assigned to this function. Moving on to the question of cyber, Senator Rounds addressed it very effectively. You talked about we spend billions, and most of this hearing is about all the money we're spending to defend ourselves against potential attacks. I don't believe we're adequately defending ourselves against actual attacks that are taking place at this very moment. And so I hope that the issue of cyber, and you use the term deter our adversaries, the problem of cyber and deterrence is something that we really haven't wrestled with very well. So I hope that's an area that you will pay some special attention to, because as I say, we're spending billions to deter potential attacks, and I don't think enough attention is being paid to deterring and managing actual attacks that are underway at this very moment.
Senator, I will commit to looking into that space, and I want to thank you for the work you've done as a leader on the Cyber Solarium Commission. I know the department already has been directed to adopt many of those recommendations.
One specific I would recommend would be to facilitate threat hunting on the defense industrial base. SolarWinds tells us that sometimes the easiest path into secure systems is through subs and supply chain, and I think that's an area where would be very fruitful in terms of defense. Also, the policy of deterrence, which we can talk about at greater length. Finally, Senator Tillis talked about procurement. We've had testimony before this committee that many smaller companies, particularly in Silicon Valley and in the technology field generally, have given up on the Pentagon. It's too complicated, it's too lengthy, it's too expensive even to fill out the forms. I commend procurement reform to you in that regard, because if we're not taking advantage of the newest ideas, the newest technologies, we're going to lose our qualitative edge, which you have defined as important. So I hope you will consider the procurement program from the point of view of a 12-person IT firm in Seattle or Portland, Maine, or Austin, Texas, and how we can make the procurement system manageable for that kind of operation.
Senator, I completely agree with you, and this ties into several elements of conversation that have come up this morning. The department has begun to pursue an adaptive acquisition pathways approach. I think that's generally moving in the right direction. If confirmed, I would want to get in and understand, to your point, how well that's serving the full range of particularly non-traditional, those alternative pathways can serve the non-traditional suppliers. The data that I've seen from the outside is that the pickup on non-traditionals is very low. We are not attracting development expertise into the supply chain for DoD from outside the normal traditional base. And that's a real concern. I think greater use of other transactional authority and other pathways has helped at least on pieces of this, but jumping over the valley of death and getting those efforts into procurement, that's the lifeblood for these small companies that cannot survive just on R&D dollars.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. I look forward to working with you on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank
you, Senator King. Senator Kramer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Hicks, for running the gauntlet. You're almost through it. Really, it's not that much more. You've been very generous with your time, and obviously you've talked to a lot of us on the phone. I appreciated our conversation last week. Appreciated drilling down on some of these issues. And I've also appreciated, frankly, listening to your answers today, as Senator Inhofe, Senator Fisher, Senator Cotton, all have said as a high priority the same thing that you and I talked about last week. That is the modernization of the triad, and not just modernization, or not just extension, but the replacement of key components of it, particularly the airborne and the land-based piece. And so I'm going to skip some of the questions I was going to ask you, and maybe focus on a couple things I didn't hear a lot about. One of the areas that Senator Cotton asked you about, I think he even sort of bifurcated the issue of policy and the product over here from the cost piece over there. I want to ask you about the cost piece, particularly as it relates to the ground-based strategic deterrent. We've talked a lot about it. You've talked a lot about it today. Any delay in that would have it seems, a time value of money, part of it that would be detrimental. Could you speak a little bit to the economics of a delay?
Senator, first of all, I also enjoyed our conversation, so thank you very much for your time with me. The challenge I face not being in the administration and not being in the department is I don't know the answer to that question. What I can assure you is that if I'm confirmed, the way you phrase that question is, does the time value of money matter? I can answer that, which is yes. We have, at various points, of course, we have had this, in my experience, and we certainly seem to have today, a challenge with regard to making some investment decisions that have been delayed and delayed and delayed. And I understand that there comes a point at which one needs to make the decision. And I am not daunted by that reality. But I don't today, until I can get in, if confirmed, and get a team in place and start to really look at the analysis that's there, I don't have a firm understanding today of what the consequences are going one way or another.
Well, I would look forward to hosting you in Minot on your way to Alaska.
Thank you.
So you can take a good look at the cost of delay. But the other issue that I haven't heard a lot about yet, but you've written about, which I've appreciated, and that is the impact on non-proliferation, the impact of delay and maybe uncertainty from our allies, whether it's Japan, South Korea, others, that rely on our triad umbrella. Maybe you could expand a little bit on that, because I have appreciated some of your writings on that topic.
Well, thank you, Senator. As you may be able to tell from some of my answers, I believe that the alliance network that the United States maintains is a significant comparative advantage over competitors. And I think we should be pretty strategic about how we consider the allied perspective so that we advance that advantage. And one of the areas where the U.S. has built up credibility with allies is through its extended deterrent. That extended deterrent has a nuclear component. There are allies who very much rely on the United States' nuclear assurances, and that helps dissuade their own internal dynamics that might look to develop nuclear weapons themselves. It helps dissuade that viewpoint. So I think it has a significant non-proliferation benefit to the United States by keeping countries that might otherwise pursue nuclear weapons from doing so.
Thank you for that. There are a whole host of other issues, but maybe I'll try to lump them all into one, and you can just respond to all of them. We've talked a lot about transparency today. You and I talked about budget transparency. I raised a concern about how some entities have had their budgets hidden from the American people for quite a while, and I worry that some of the secrecy might be more to avoid scrutiny, frankly, than to protect capability. I'm going to avoid some of the specific stuff in this setting, but can you promise to look at some of the organizations and programs within the Department of Defense to make sure the public knows, or even, frankly, the Congress knows to the maximum extent possible where the money is going? I'm talking about pass-through budgets that give a false sense of that budget level. The other thing is, again, on your way to Minot on your way to Alaska, I'd love to have you come to Grand Forks as well. And, there are only 2 bases left between Michigan and Montana along the northern tier. That Arctic mission is very important. Obviously, Minot plays an important role in that. The other one being Grand Forks with its ISR missions. And I'll just throw ISR out there as well. You and I talked about the importance of ISR, particularly in the Middle East, Africa, other places. And some of the cannibalization, as I see it, taking place to make room for these more modern systems. Just a sense of as the COO, I appreciate that illustration. What your thoughts might be on how we balance some of those budget stresses and strategic needs.
Sure, Senator. Let me first comment on the transparency point. I will commit to looking into the questions around, in particular, the pass-through budget with the Air Force, but also more generally looking at the transparency questions to ensure we're telling taxpayers and, of course, members of Congress the maximum that we can do that is operationally safe and wise. The challenge of balancing ready today and ready tomorrow is sort of at the heart of how the Department of Defense is constantly working through its budget and program alignment. I think that tension will exist at any resource level, and I would anticipate that being a major issue that I would face if I were confirmed. I do think that the imperative to be ready tomorrow is very significant right now. I think the resources will always, as I said, be tight and can be especially tight right now. So we're going to probably have to think about doing things differently. And that's where concepts become so important to figure out how we connect the resources it's really the aims we have to the capabilities we want in a fiscally responsible way.
Thank you very much. I appreciate all of that, and I look forward to supporting your.
Thank you, Senator Kramer. Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Chairman. Dr. Hicks, welcome. I was actually quite encouraged by the previous administration's efforts to increase DoD investments in critical R&D priorities like directed energy, hypersonics, I believe you mentioned, artificial intelligence. I'd note, however, that these technologies are really of little use unless they're transitioned out of our labs and into the hands of actual service members around the world. If confirmed, how would you use your role overseeing the department's internal management processes to speed and improve that tech transition process?
Thank you, Senator. First, I agree with you that there has been some positive momentum in key areas of R&D, and I do think a sustained level of R&D investment is vital. But also, to your point, we actually have to field capabilities, and that's a place where DoD has really struggled. Some of the tools that the deputy could have, working especially with the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is to develop some incentive approaches to get field experiments underway, even beyond experiments up to major exercise level use of capabilities and prototypes that can start to demonstrate the value of some of these new approaches. And when we can demonstrate value, then we're in a much better position to have a dialogue with Congress and with industry about where those capabilities can take us, and that can help us overcome that valley of death. I also think, frankly, we should be looking at how we think about new starts so that we can manage the appropriation cycle more effectively. If I were confirmed, I'd want to get in and understand what makes sense both from a congressional oversight perspective and from the department's perspective, especially in areas like software where the cycle time is so much faster than the typical appropriation cycle.
Thank you. I would really encourage your focus on this issue, and in particular with directed energy. I've watched as the experiments have been proving themselves over and over again, but the desire within the Pentagon to sort of chase the perfect application when there are so many applications where it can provide real value to a warfighter now is a real tension, and I think is in many cases doing us a disservice. You helped lead the Biden team's transition at the Department of Defense over the last several months.
I've read with great concern a number of public reports that the previous administration worked to block key transition officials from accessing critical information related to worldwide operations. What's your assessment of how those obstructions impacted important DoD programs and operations, and what can we do on this committee to give you and Secretary Austin the resources you need as you stand up this new team?
Senator, I did have the privilege of leading the Defense Agency Review Team, and let me first say that the vast majority of folks that we worked with in the Pentagon were incredibly helpful, knowledgeable, forthcoming, and it's impressive every day, frankly, to have gone in and seen those military and civilian professionals doing their job. So the challenges we faced were really around a handful of folks that made things difficult. I think the biggest challenge that I will face if confirmed because of this is around budget transparency. The Trump administration worked on an FY22 budget. That's not unusual, but typically that information is shared with the transition team because the administration will owe to Congress a president's budget submission in the spring. So the inability to look at that information, the team, I think, after I was confirmed, so I was not a part of it, did have some ability to look at the information late in January. But I think it will cause some delay in the timeline by which we can give budget quality information back to Congress. So that would be the area I would ask for a little relief on understanding.
Dr. Hicks, 2 weeks ago, I asked Secretary Austin during his confirmation hearing about his plan to prioritize PFAS cleanup and remediation. And I have to be honest, I was discouraged when Secretary Austin sort of deflected DOD's responsibility for PFAS contamination in communities around the country, including one of the hardest hit communities around Cannon Air Force Base in New Mexico, despite overwhelming evidence that DoD activities there were the sole source of the contamination. And that is the case in many of these instances. If confirmed, how will you work to prioritize DoD's efforts to stand up and address PFAS cleanup and work with these communities?
Well, Senator, first, I think it's important that senior leadership in the Pentagon meet with the families themselves and the community members and understand what exactly has occurred and what the consequences have been. I also think it's imperative, as Secretary Austin has done, to make it clear that it's a priority for the department, both to ensure it's not putting contaminants out into its military families, military service members, and of course the communities that surround them. And that when we see instances, we're working with EPA. I know there's now CERCLA authority that we can access with regard to PFAS, that we are working on solutions to do cleanup, and frankly, to meet the timeline. Congress has given us a clear timeline for removing PFAS out of our firefighting approaches, and if confirmed, I'm committed to meeting that timeline.
Thank you, Senator Heinrich. Now via WebEx, Senator Warren.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations on your nomination, Dr. Hicks. I appreciated the opportunity to speak with you last week and enjoyed hearing your views on a range of topics. I have been very critical about the size of the defense budget. It's long been a concern of mine, but after the past year, watching more than 400,000 fellow Americans die, tens of millions unemployed due to COVID-19, millions more who are lined up at food banks, and even millions more who are on the threshold of losing their homes and being put out on the street. Spending $740 billion a year on this one piece of the federal budget is unconscionable. A budget is about priorities, and we continue to overinvest in defense while underinvesting in public health and so much more that would keep us safe and that would save lives. So let me ask the question this way. Dr. Hicks, do you believe that we can find ways to lower the top line budget number and then spend that money more effectively without sacrificing our security?
Senator, first let me say I agree with you that the nation has seen in this past year a crisis that is generational in its magnitude, and I certainly understand how it calls into question what the priorities are across our government. I also, though, believe that we are a nation that can afford the defense that it needs to have, and the focus, sometimes it's about spending more, sometimes about spending less, but the focus on the top line number can really obscure a more important conversation around what is it we want our military, in the case of the Defense Department, to do, and what hard choices are involved in getting it in a place to be capable of doing that, being transparent about the risk. So my view to your direct question is I do think there are ways for the Defense Department to be more efficient, to be more effective. I think some of those tools, as I've suggested, involve things like operational concept advancement, making the right kinds of investments, making sure we have a competitive industrial base. But frankly, some of the things, some of the levers that are available take a lot of partnership between Congress, the executive branch, industry, and others to make some hard choices. It would be hard to significantly squeeze the defense budget in light of the threats that we face without that kind of effort together to get to some hard choices.
Well, I just want to make sure I'm understanding your answer here. Are you saying that, yes, we can reduce the top line number without sacrificing our security so long as we work together on this? Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yes, and so long as we're willing to make some decisions that may incur risk themselves. Yeah.
Fair enough. So one of your key tasks is going to be linking the military budget to our strategy and to the President's and Secretary Austin's priorities. So if President Biden directs Secretary Austin to lower the top line, and I hope he does, what will be the biggest challenges that you will have to overcome?
I think the biggest challenge is the balancing of the readiness for challenges of today, threats of today, and preparing for the future. That's sort of the overarching piece. But I think more to the mechanics of how we do that will be getting buy-in and a constructive approach with, again, Congress working together with the administration and vice versa. In a dialogue, and having industry and other stakeholders willing to come to the table for the greater good to get that done.
Okay, if confirmed, one of the first things you're going to need to do is review our nuclear weapons program. And I know that you believe in a safe and secure and reliable nuclear deterrent, but we're going to spend $44.5 billion on nuclear weapons this year, which is more than the entire budget for the State Department and foreign operations accounts. Will you commit that your review will not simply be a rubber stamp of our current nuclear strategy, but that you really will examine and re-question the core assumptions that underpin it?
Absolutely, Senator.
Good. I really appreciate that. I want a strong defense, but I want one that is tailored to meet the real threats that we face. And more importantly, I want that defense to be built on a strong economic foundation here at home. But that's not what we have today. We face staggering economic inequality that's only getting worse as a consequence of this crisis. And yet the military continues to chug along, disconnected from this reality, plowing billions of dollars into the same big, expensive weapons systems that we've been buying for more than 20 years. We've got to fix this by fundamentally rethinking how we spend our money to protect our nation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Dr. Hicks. Good to see you, and thank you for your willingness to take on this responsibility. It is a large one. Dr. Hicks, listening to Secretary Gates' introduction, I was reminded of a recent book that he wrote cautioning us to be wary of over-militarizing foreign policy in favor of non-military instruments of power, particularly as we enter into a number of gray zone conflicts, something that you and I were able to speak about at great length earlier, which I appreciate that time. But in the 2020 NDAA, we required the department to designate a principal information operations advisor. This responsibility was given to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. But based on your experience as a principal deputy to that position, you certainly, I think, would have a better appreciation for the scope of the responsibilities, what's necessary than most. And so with that in mind, the challenges related to dealing with warfare in the gray zone. Would you have advised assigning it to the Undersecretary of Policy, or would you have preferred to have it in a more direct and principal position by itself?
Senator, first of all, thank you for the conversation the other day. I do agree with you overall, of course, that information is a critical element of the way in which we have to think about threats and challenges of the future. We live that, frankly, every day, of course. I'm not familiar with the principal information advisor, I think I got that name slightly wrong, position. So if confirmed, I would be happy to look at that position, the legislation developing it, and the disposition, whether policy is the right place to put that.
Well, I'd appreciate that, because we obviously, I think it's important. We put it in the NDA. It's areas that you've written about as you have a chance to do a deeper dive into what will be associated with that. And I would hope that you would give us advice as to how we properly resource that position and to make sure that it gets the attention that it deserves. You have written and thought a great deal about gray zone activities and the challenges that will present. How do you view the department contributing meaningful to a whole of government approach, which you have written about extensively, and talk a little bit about how we need to engage other agencies and break down some of the silos that exist currently, which impede our ability to deal with these gray zone threats?
Senator, I do think information is an incredibly important element for all of government to be thinking through all of the national security enterprise. I do think it is primarily an element where the State Department for Overseas and other agencies such as the Broadcast Board of Governors, follow on, and the Department of Homeland Security and others should be focused on here at home. The Defense Department brings some specialized expertise to that is almost always in a supporting role. They bring a depth of doctrinal development on how to think about things like political warfare, as we used to call it in the Cold War. And so I think in a supporting way, DoD can provide helpful insights in how we think about the information domain.
Part of dealing with the gray zones I mentioned in the question is we have to coordinate a lot of activities, cyber, and I know you've addressed a number of questions related to cyber already here today. But we have appointed a national cyber director, which will face pretty much a daunting task of trying to coordinate all of these operations and the resources of agencies, which the director doesn't really exercise any direct control over, so it makes the job even more complicated. What is your sense on the role of the National Cyber Director, and if confirmed, what is your commitment to work with that director to coordinate these activities so that we can be more effective in addressing this significant threat?
Senator, I applaud this committee in particular and others who were central to putting in the National Cyber Director position into the NDAA. Cyber is a challenge set that we have learned, over a decade plus, has just constantly challenged us in terms of working across different elements of government, from even inside the intelligence community, let alone DoD again, DHS, which has significant responsibilities, and other actors. So I think the advantage of having that director is pulling a lot of those threads together and creating some unity of vision. If confirmed, it is my anticipation that I would work alongside other key elements in the department with that national cyber director to make sure that the DoD components of the solution set on cyber are moving in the right direction and supportive of the national approach.
Thank you, Dr. Hicks.
Thank you. Senator Blackburn via WebEx.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to say thank you ever so much, Ms. Hicks, for your time last week. I appreciate the conversation that we had and your thoughtful consideration of the topic we started with in that conversation, which is civilian-military relations. And you know that this is important to me, that there is concern over the erosion of civilian voices in the Pentagon. This goes back, as we discussed, into the Obama-era budget cuts, which we saw that lead to a diminishment of morale and really a breakdown of structure in the Pentagon. So moving forward, we must have a very healthy cadre of career civilians in key oversight areas for an efficient and effective Pentagon that really fights our wars and serves the needs of our service members. And I appreciate your perspective and your comments on that. We also talked about China and cyber and space and the vital importance of public-private partnerships. And as I told you, I discussed this with General Austin. So for the record, I'd like for you to touch on how you will view these public-private partnerships with companies, with universities, our national labs, which we also discussed, to make certain that we are standing strong against great power competition and that we are ready for the challenges that will come to us.
Senator, thanks so much for raising both of these issues. Let me start with the first. I, of course, think we should be as efficient as possible in the delivery of capability in the Defense Department, but it is my view that we have, in the efforts to gain efficiency, we have cut to the bone on civilian oversight in some key areas. If you look just at the prior conversation with Senator Peters on civilian oversight of policy, that's an area very near and dear to my heart where I know we have really cut out a lot of capacity and capability. And it's hard for the civilians to provide the necessary oversight if they aren't resourced appropriately for doing so. So I do believe, if confirmed, making sure that we can act on and execute on the responsibility for civilian oversight to create healthy civil-military relations is vital. On your second point about some of the challenges we face with regard to China and in many different domains and the need for public-private partnerships, it is my strong view that the United States, if it leverages public-private partnerships effectively, can outcompete the Chinese civil-military fusion model. That model is statist. It is not taking full advantage of a vibrant private sector, and the United States has that advantage if it can tap into it. Tapping into it means, exactly as you say, working with our world-class academic community, our world-class national labs, and the sectors of the economy, the private sector elements that are working on some of the hardest problems that we face. If we can leverage those successfully, reducing barriers as we have discussed throughout the morning, I think that will put the United States in a much better competitive position than a China or a Russia.
All right. I am going to end with that. You've been generous with your time this morning. I have a couple of other questions. one on nuclear deterrent, one on cost savings at DOD. I will send those to you as QFRs. And we also touched on workforce development in our phone conversation. And I want to get a couple of answers from you on that. But in the interest of time, I will yield back my 25 seconds.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Senator Manchin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Hicks, for being here. And I know it's been a long morning for you, but appreciate it very much, and also wanting to serve at the level you'll be serving at. And I look forward to supporting you. I would like to ask you something that we've been working on, which is the Chief Management Officer. And it's been kind of shuffled around and not paid attention to, and it's just such a vital position, I believe, to try to get our financial house in order. So I wasn't sure how your feelings would be about that, and you know, it's when you look back, the cultural resistance from the Defense Business Board and the GAO and all of them have been unbelievable. And there's some critical information I think it could really help us. So I didn't know what your commitment would be to that for the National Defense Strategy, and if you believe we have the bandwidth to be necessary champion for the business reform.
Senator, I think business reform is a vital element of the job jar for the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and if confirmed, I would put serious time and energy into that portfolio. The recent end of the CMO role was followed by the current Deputy Secretary of Defense putting forth a memo that explained the disposition of those responsibilities. And if I'm confirmed, I would want to get my team in place and look at that memo and the plan that's put in place to make sure it's effective.
Sure. To follow up on that, you know, the whole culture of spend it or lose it.
The
spend it or lose it culture.
Yeah, I think
that's within government across the board, but especially in
Yep.
defense, which is the biggest purchasing agent.
I think we have to
how do we
change,
change that?
Yeah, I think we have to change the incentives around how you promote business reform, and exactly if the incentive structure is you only get your money if you spend it inefficiently and can hold on to it and hide the ball, we're never going to get the business reform we need. So we need to change the incentive structure.
We found out in the state, when I was governor at state level, basically if we rewarded the agencies that didn't spend it all rather than wasting it, gave them a little bit of bump the next year because of the savings they had, it made them be more prudent because they weren't penalized. Might be some things we could talk to you about. I think it'd be really great. It doesn't take a whole lot. The other thing is on holding the prime contractor that does business with us, the big boys, the Boeings and all them, hold them accountable for basically the security of their networks down into their subcontractors. That's where we're getting picked off. That's where basically the hacking, that's where all the information is being stolen from. That has to be secured, and it has not. I think we've identified it. They just haven't secured it. We're not holding there's no penalty for the big prime contractor to basically secure their subs. So they just rely on the subs, whatever, and you want to know how they get in the back door, that's where they come from. And the only thing we're asking for is hold those prime accountable financially, and also basically being able to continue to be in good standing to do business. I didn't know if that's brought to your attention or not.
Senator, I would look forward to working with you and your team on exactly these kind of ideas. We have to change the accountability. We have to improve the accountability, change the incentives.
The hard thing is you have people that basically keep asking the question, how can we spend more money than all the other challengers that we have around the world? And we don't get the efficiency from it. And I think it's basically, we're not afraid to spend the money. We just want to get results from it. And I think there's a lot of waste and redundancy that we could really work on. Now, my final question would be basically, how do you rate the threats we have as a country, our international threats? And if you'd rate whether it be China, Russia, Iran, this and that, what do you see to where we have to basically be on our game and step up our game, if not?
Senator,
greatest threats.
Yes, Senator. The United States has regretfully not been able to have just one threat that focuses its attention, and this period is no different. From a Defense Department perspective, China is the clear pacing challenge in almost all capability areas. There are a few areas where the Russians still are pacing the United States, particularly in the strategic realm. And I think that's the key element of how we need to think about changing and shifting the force.
How about with cyber? Who's the big hitters in cyber? The same? You rate them?
Yes, Senator, I would rank them the same. I will say I look forward, if confirmed, to getting more briefings than I have had recently on exactly what improvements the Chinese and Russians are putting in place. But my view is that the Chinese are probably still the pacing challenge there.
The only thing I would be cautioned on is that basically a lot of the smaller, whether it be the Irans or whether it be different small players, they become big players in the realm of cyber, what they can do to us or what they try to do. It's very important. But look forward to working with you, especially the business reforms that need to be made.
Well, thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Dr. Hicks. Look forward to supporting you. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Manchin. Senator Scott.
Thank you, Chairman. Dr. Hicks, we had a nice conversation the other day. Thank you for your background and your beliefs. What do you, when you were just talking with Senator Manchin about pacing challenge, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, it's the term means the challenge that focuses us on where the bar is, where the measure is. And so in most capability areas, China is the one who's setting the measuring stick for how advanced the capability is and how large a challenge it is for us to overcome.
Okay. Do you believe we can overcome the challenge of China, or do you think it's too late?
Senator, I don't think it's too. I don't think I would sit here if I thought it was too late. I think the United States has some inherent comparative advantages if we can tap into them effectively.
What would you consider to be our advantages and their advantages?
Sure. Some of the advantages, I think the U.S. Well, I'll focus on the U.S. if that's all right for operational security purposes. But I think the U.S. major advantage is first and foremost its alliance structure and global network, its ability to galvanize and lead on the world stage. I think we need to make sure that we have that ability to create momentum. I think in the operational sense, the United States has some advantages. Fifth generation aircraft is one. Obviously, our undersea capabilities are another. And I think in the economic or the fundamental competition space, I think the United States has a better model for its economy, and it can be more competitive than Chinese can in using their CivMil fusion statist approach versus a U.S. Dynamic approach that brings in the private sector.
If American citizens decided to stop buying Chinese products, how big of an impact would that have on China's ability to continue to be a threat?
Senator, that's something I would have to look into. I regret I've never looked at that assessment of what the implications would be, but I'd be happy to continue a conversation on that.
Okay. So the approach we've taken with Taiwan, it looks to me, it seems we've been pretty ambiguous about what we would do to defend Taiwan. What do you think about that position? And it sure appears when you look at what China's been doing now with infiltrating their airspace that our position has not done anything to deter China. Do you agree with that? And is there something we ought to be doing that would let Xi know that we're serious about defending Taiwan?
Well, first, I think we have to be crystal clear about our commitments to Taiwan. I think President Biden has done that, and certainly Congress has had 40 years of strong bipartisan support. So I think being consistent in making clear that we will meet the requirements of the Taiwan Relations Act, that we will meet the 6 assurances to Taiwan, and that we will operate in accordance with the 3 communiques between the United States and China. I think those are important to keep foremost. But those are the words. I think in the action category, 2 broad areas. One is the U.S.'s own deterrent capability, the Pacific Deterrence Initiative that this committee and the House counterpart put forward in this latest NDAA provides some opportunity for us to build out that deterrent capability of the U.S. And then specifically with regard to Taiwan, I think the United States needs to be working closely with Taiwan to ensure it has that the U.S. can support its approach for its self-defense.
So we're running pretty big budget deficits up here, and we have now over $27 trillion worth of debt. So there's going to be a lot of pressure to see where we can save money. Do you believe that that we ought to be reducing our defense budget when we have the issues with China and Iran and Russia and then North Korea?
Senator, I believe the United States can meet the challenges it faces in defense. I think it can provide a strategy-driven approach to its defense budget, and that it can still deliver good value to the taxpayer in doing so.
So that means you would be okay with budget cuts in defense?
That means I think that we should be driven by strategy, and that we have the ability to afford the defense that we believe we need among all the other requirements we might have, whether that's a slightly higher top line or a slightly lower top line. Personally, I think is less relevant than are we delivering the capabilities we need for the defense we should have.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Duckworth via WebEx.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize. My webcam does not seem to be working, so I'm just going to be on audio. Dr. Hicks, it's good to see you again. I can see you. You can't see me. Sorry about that. After speaking with you last week, I am confident that your leadership would help the Department of Defense address some of the most urgent national security issues facing our country. I think you would bring substantial expertise to a critically important role, and you would bear much of the responsibility for day-to-day decisions that could shape the future trajectory of DoD for many years. If confirmed as the Deputy Secretary of Defense, I would want you to use your authority and leadership to address a number of systemic issues within the department, including rebalancing the relationship between DoD and the State Department, rebuilding the team of professional civilian leaders in the DoD, and returning focus to underfunded but critically important parts of DoD's budget, like our logistics enterprise, and renewing efforts to increase diversity and inclusion among the senior ranks of our military service and broader national security community. Today, though, I want to focus my questions on the most urgent issues facing the Department of Defense, competing with the People's Republic of China, the PRC. Dr. Hicks, I know that we agree that we must use a whole of society approach, and you've discussed this at length this morning, to present ourselves as a viable alternative to China for economic, military, and diplomatic partnerships, especially in the Asia-Pacific region. We've also discussed the need to increase our military engagement in the region below the threshold of armed conflict. If confirmed, what immediate steps would you take to help DoD build relationships with allies and partners in Southeast Asia and counter China's rise in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, Senator, thank you very much. I would say it's good to see you, but it's certainly good to hear you. I think you've laid out the challenge set very, very well. As the Deputy Secretary, I imagine I will be focused internal to the department, and the Secretary will be in particular focused on some of these broader questions of the allied approaches. But I will say, based on my experience, there is an opportunity, significant opportunity. There's openness and interest from partners throughout Asia. You and I have spoken about Indonesia and Vietnam, for instance. I think there's opportunity to demonstrate that the United States is willing to exercise freedom of navigation, freedom of air as well, and to help them build out their capacity, whether it's in something like health security because of COVID challenges, all the way up to maritime domain awareness in the South China Sea. I think there's plenty of opportunity. I'll highlight the Pacific Deterrence Initiative that this committee and its House counterpart have put forward as a venue, an opportunity, a mechanism for the Department of Defense to put some good ideas forward to Congress to make sure we're fulfilling the direction that you have given the department in these areas. And if confirmed, I would look to be using my role helping to pull that budget connectivity to the strategy forward to make sure that we're filling that basket with some good initiatives.
Thank you. We also discussed
Senator Duckworth, let me interrupt just a moment. Senator Reid is presiding. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Hicks, we discussed some creative approaches to improving our military partnerships in Southeast Asia, such as sending the Army Corps of Engineers to assist with flooding in Jakarta, Indonesia, or expanding our international military education programs so that foreign junior officers and senior enlisted could study at U.S. civilian institutions with ROTC programs, such as Northern Illinois University or the University of Georgia or any numerous places where there are wonderful ROTC programs. If confirmed, would you commit to exploring creative ideas such as these that could be implemented quickly and relatively cheaply to build stronger military ties, military-to-military ties with Southeast Asian nations in the near term?
Yes, Senator, I would commit to doing so.
Thank you. I bet you can guess what my next topic is, logistics. What is your assessment of the most urgent shortfalls that we must address at U.S. Transportation Command and the rest of our logistics enterprise?
Senator, logistics really is the lifeblood, and I think contested logistics is a key operational challenge set for the U.S. military today and going forward. Cybersecurity is probably at the forefront of that challenge set, and that's obviously both for the military assets, but also the significant civilian assets upon which we rely for our logistics. I think behind that would be the survivability of our logistics chain and our fuel consumption, and ensuring that we can have a light footprint with regard to logistics, maybe even leveraging capabilities that allow us to create capability in place.
Thank you. And I have additional questions I would like to submit to you for the record that have to do with additional follow-up on logistics, and then also on diversity and inclusion within the DoD. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to go ahead and submit those for the questions for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you. On behalf of Chairman Inhofe, Senator Hawley, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Hicks, thank you for being here. Congratulations on your nomination. Let me ask you about the National Defense Strategy Commission, of which you were a member. That commission wrote that, and I'm quoting now, successfully competing in Europe and the Indo-Pacific region while also managing escalation dynamics requires positioning substantial capability forward to deter and prevent a fait accompli by an agile, opportunistic adversary. Now, when I asked Secretary Austin about this, he responded that he agreed with that assessment. Let me just ask you if you stand by the Commission's assessment that the U.S. military must position substantial capability forward, I'm still quoting, to deter and prevent a fait accompli.
I do.
Very good. Secretary Austin also wrote in response to me that a combat credible forward deterrent posture is instrumental to the U.S. military's ability to deter and, if necessary, deny a fait accompli scenario. Do you agree with the Secretary's emphasis on the need for deterrence by denial, especially when it comes to a fait accompli scenario?
I do.
Let me ask you about, I'm glad to hear that also, thank you. Let me ask you about something that the President, State Department has recently said with regard to Taiwan. You were talking with Senator Scott a moment ago about Taiwan. President Biden's State Department has recently described America's commitment to Taiwan as rock solid, that's their words, which is exactly as it should be. With that in mind, do you think that China is more or less likely to attempt a fait accompli against Taiwan if it knows that we would be able to defeat such an attempt?
Less likely.
In that case, wouldn't you agree that we'd want to maintain our ability to defeat a Chinese fait accompli against Taiwan, and that would help strengthen our deterrence? Is that a fair assessment?
It is, Senator. I would only add that Taiwan primarily also needs to be engaged in that defense.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly right. Let me ask you about your experience previously in the Pentagon. President Obama tried to pivot to Asia famously when you were last at the Pentagon, but he and DOD in particular ended up getting drawn back continually into the Middle East due to events there. Can you just give us your sense, what does the department need to do differently this time around to make sure that we avoid the same outcome?
Senator, the rebalance to Asia, pivot to Asia approach did precede both ISIS and the Russian annexation of Crimea. And those put serious stressors, particularly in a period of the Budget Control Act. So I think it's about, frankly, as Secretary Austin has said, matching resources to strategy, to policy, to the will of the American people. And we need to make sure that we have our defense assets and resources focused on the areas where the American public expects the Defense Department to be.
Very good. Let me just ask you further on this subject. President Obama's former acting special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan recently wrote quoting now, for the long term, the United States will need a counterterrorism capability that does not depend on a permanent U.S. military presence in Afghanistan. And she went on to say that the Biden administration should work swiftly to develop such options, including by ensuring U.S. capacity to mount operations in Afghanistan from outside the country. Do you think that DoD should be working with its interagency partners to evaluate and develop options along those lines?
So, Senator, my view is that we have had 20 years of honorable service by our military members in Afghanistan, working alongside allies and partners. President Biden has ordered a holistic review of where we are on Afghanistan policy, and frankly, holistic review is the right approach. This isn't just about end strength numbers on the ground. This is about achieving the holistic approach related to counterterrorism and a few other areas that is important and what it takes to do that. So I'm very supportive of that approach, and if confirmed as Deputy Secretary of Defense, I would work in support of trying to determine what the right answer to your question is.
Very good. And would you also support having the department brief Congress on its findings as these reviews that you've talked about get underway and then conclude and reach some deliverables so that we here can have an informed debate about the best path forward in Afghanistan?
Absolutely, Senator.
Thank you. Finally, I'm almost out of time, but let me just ask you about our allies. We're spending about 4% of our GDP to defend ourselves. That's a big number, as you've referenced several times today. Shouldn't we insist that our European allies, especially wealthier ones like Germany, spend at least the 2% that they agreed to back in 2014?
Senator, I regret this is a slightly long answer from me, so let me try to do it more briefly than I probably would otherwise. I think we need to make sure that we're taking a strategic approach to what commitment means. I think we need to make sure that allies are as into the security relationship as we are. Sometimes it's through spending, sometimes it's through defense spending, and sometimes that commitment is expressed in other ways. And I think we should be strategic about how we consider those commitments.
Can I just, Mr. Chairman, this is my last question, I'll stop. Just on that point, about your point about strategy, Dr. Hicks, isn't it a matter of strategic importance to us, however, that our European allies do as much as they possibly can for their own defense in Europe, precisely because, as you said just a moment ago, the pacing threat for us is in Indo-PACOM. We face a challenge there from the Chinese government and a rising China, such that we really haven't seen a peer competitor, the likes of which we haven't seen in our lifetimes. I mean, so isn't it a matter of strategic importance to urge our allies to do all that they can in partnership with us, but in their own defense?
I do believe that. I think that's true of every ally.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. And Dr. Hicks, thank you for your very impressive testimony. And I don't think I speak for myself, but I look forward to working with you. There are no further witnesses or colleagues. The hearing's adjourned. Thank you, Dr. Hicks.
Thank you, Senator.